Welcome to, I guess this is episode 3 now. Holy shiitake.
Yeah, episode 3.
Welcome to episode 3 of The Youthful Bridge. We have quite the interesting guest with us today.
That we do.
Mr. Devin Newmeyer. So Devin, I could probably provide an introduction for you, but we're going to go ahead and let you decide what you want the viewers to call you.
I would say I am just like your average person, in a sense. I'm just on a quest for understanding the very fundamental natures of reality. And I'm
Not
using...
your average person.
No.
Go on.
I'm using the resources capable to me through the internet to gain this knowledge and to further refine my perspective. And I think the tool of the internet is such a profound thing, and anybody can reach levels of enlightenment no other human could have before with the means of it.
That's incredible. So a lot of times the internet is seen as a bad thing, especially by older generations, and it is in a lot of sense. Media has a lot of adverse effects.
Sure.
How do you kind of stay away from those and use the good effects, and what is something that someone in your situation could do to not be just completely encompassed as a marketing tool for large companies and instead gain knowledge?
Sure, I think it starts with having underlying perceptual understanding and understanding the fundamentals of the situation, right? Not letting your internet use go completely not only unchecked but unguided, right? That is the big thing. It's that lots of things on the internet they're just means of, it's mental popcorn, right? It's means of distracting and escaping existential dread in the most egregious way to say it. I mean, what I really just think people need to do is people need to have greater direction within their thought and have underlying understandings, knowing that the implications of being involved with these internet apps and in the dopamine releasing, right, that your brain is doing when you are taking part in these apps, right, they're equivalent to a cocaine high, right? And the implications on the psyche are profound when you put it on a large scale and when you give everyone that can speak a phone, right? Because the implications of that are going to be a youth hyper addicted to social media, right? And the destruction of actual social interaction where we all degrade into people just reliant on things supplied to us by Silicon Valley and the tech kleptocracy.
So in a sense, there's the media side you really don't think provides, unless of course there are people who run businesses and things by it. We're able to do a podcast over media, but when you're talking about the addiction to media, the addiction to your own self-image based on media,
sure,
that's very unhealthy. Whereas we also have the ability to pretty much access any information available in the world at any time. That would be the good side of the internet.
Sure. It just has that double-edged sword in the sense to where it can provide enlightenment. It can provide infinite understanding, but at the same time, it can be very encapsulating and it can make you stagnant within your perceptions, right? It's all about how you view the world. And if you are not introspecting and trying to define even your own behaviors.
And introspecting, give us a quick definition of introspecting.
Introspecting, I would say, is looking at what you are doing action-wise. Not what you think or the story your ego is telling you. But look at what you're doing, right? Look at your bank statements, right? Look at the politics that you mostly align with, right? And then truly dissect them for the fundamentals of what they are, right? What being a Republican means, what being a Democrat means, right? All these different things and terms and symbols people throw around without having the actual understanding of what they are, right? They're just symbols being thrown around so people can have referentiality to specific things and assimilate with them, right? It's not about the Republican ideology and conservatism, right? It's not about Democrats being progressive or trying to fight for more left-leaning policies. It's about my group and their group, right? And that is especially
toxic.
It's toxic, sure.
Yeah.
And it breeds because also I'm also not a proponent for, like, I'm not also trying to say that I think specifically what really is the big problem is the fact that not these institutions are over empowering, right? Not that they're super intelligent and doing a great job, but more so that people rely on the frameworks provided to them.
Okay.
Rather than deriving their own understandings
Their
of
own
what's going
understanding
on.
of what's going on. Okay.
So you think they're kind of like being brainwashed by like these?
Brainwashed is like is a strong word, but I mean, I would say socially conditioned, right?
Gotcha.
I mean, brainwashed seems immediate when you say it, at least within the way I perceive that. Like, I would just make sure to specify that it is a conditioning, right? This has been in place and this has been happening for probably the larger part of 6 decades now, 7 decades. So there has been this intense polarization between the political spectrum. And to expand that more, the polarization is also, to put it into a good analogy, they're like specific aisles or corridors of thought that people assimilate into. And it's like putting horse blinders on. It's that when you only assimilate to certain understandings, right, into certain political beliefs and only ascribe to certain things based on the framework that the underlying political party is giving you, right, you will never have true clarity on the actual situation. You will be fed a narrative that is benefiting someone else.
Wow, well put.
Yeah, that
was really well put.
That was awesome. Yeah, no, so I think when you're talking about this idea of introspecting and not following that corridor, we were talking about how to properly use media to not be just fed one alley, and to be able to really look at that introspection on yourself. So how do you use media that's different from how most people use media? I mean, most people use media, they scroll through, they look at one thing, and they go down an alley. And that's kind of a new thing now, as people are put into these social media loopholes, or whatever you want to call it, towards one mindset, and also towards particular products. You know what I mean? Because it is a marketing thing.
Yeah.
So how do you kind of stay out of that?
I think it's specifically just through that tool of introspection.
Okay.
It's that I truly I don't have a stable grounding within having any ideology. I am very, very ideological in that sense, that I'm trying to find a framework that works best for everybody, not necessarily what works best for me, right? The big thing within Western society and Western culture is that, especially now, things have become very egocentric within the individual.
Okay.
People are really honed in and focused on their own wants and their own desires, more so over the benefit of their community, right? And I think what happens is you get that direct polarization from that breeding of narcissism, from social media fueling people to want likes and self-affirmation from these comments, right? There's all these little things that fuel narcissism in very small ways that we're not necessarily looking at. And I think that especially when you're reshaping the youth's minds, and you're reshaping even adults' minds on these technologies, the implications are going to be vast. And especially one thing that's going to come out of it is this political polarization. The fact that we can have people that have basically talk to themselves, or not even talk themselves, have been fed a certain perception so strong, and they have such a small grounding that they storm the Capitol building, right? That shows
we just did a TikTok about that.
It's this political polarization that we are just now starting to really get exponential and really start to get disgusting, because the line at which reality is agreed upon is fading. The death of truth is ensuing. Right, and that's one thing I've talked to you about a lot. It's truth death is this new phenomenon within, the postmodern era, where people are getting so many different feeds of information, potential feeds of information, that the line at which we even agree on fundamental facts is disintegrating, right? And that is going to further escalate this political polarization.
Okay, and for you, the way to kind of stop that is to look at the why behind every action in your life.
I never said I'm trying to stop it.
Okay.
I do feel that this is a necessary mechanism, right? This radicalization we are seeing out of people, right, is not because people are just crazy all of a sudden.
Yeah.
This is in a response, right, to a system that has disenfranchised a vast swath of America, right? And when I say a swath of America, I mean everyone that doesn't hold large portions of stocks and bonds and are direct beneficiaries of this egregious economic system we all live in.
Yeah. Yeah, so basically what I'm getting is we should buy a large amount of stocks and bonds.
Fuck you.
And then, no, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. Okay.
Buy Tesla.
So
On Tesla.
yeah, and another thing I kind of heard there was, not everyone is right. I mean, obviously, except for me and you
Obviously,
running this.
That's
Okay. so, sorry. Yeah.
without question.
So
Come on.
basically, buy as many. No. All right. So what I kind of heard there is you were talking about a thesis. Okay, and when we were speaking on a different time, you kind of spoke about how introspection can lead to each individual person creating that thesis. So can you talk a little bit about, you called it a master thesis.
Or a grand thesis, whatever
Grand
have
thesis,
you.
okay.
It's more so that idea of having a thesis is thinking about this. So we are supplied ideology from given things within our culture, right? Whether it's Republicans or Democrats, whether it's your mom having conservative values or your dad having progressive values, right? Whether anything, you are receiving cultural input from your society and you're developing a perception based on all of that, right? Developing a grand thesis and really unlocking the power of introspection within yourself, being able to detach from your underlying perceptions and try to look at things fundamentally and not how you have been basically trained to think. Your brain has been trained to think based on its stimuli that it's been taking in, right? And it's about truly taking in other perceptions, right? It's about not being bound enough to one, right? Like how people are given these frameworks of perception, these frameworks of ideology from these given groups, right, in society that are trying to push out meta-narratives to have people believe, right, to assimilate to their interest, right? What it's truly about, and for people to gain back power within our political system in our world, is by developing understandings articulate enough, right, to where they do not have to rely on frameworks supplied to them by their culture. They can rely on their very intuition, and they can have grounding, so they don't look at a QAnon article and think that, they need to go storm the Capitol, or
Yeah.
thinking that Biden's an actual competent president, or thinking that Trump's an actual competent president. We shouldn't be at the point to where we are saying, well, we should pick the less of two evils. We should be at the point to where we're saying, well, we have wealth inequality that is greater than any time in human history, right? We have a financial system that nobody understands and is completely predatory on absolutely everyone in the economy that doesn't hold massive amounts of shares in certain companies that are going up, etc., right? There really is a massive gap in knowledge of people's understandings because they're fundamentally relying on these perceptual frameworks that feed them what they're believing.
Would you say there's a solution?
It is, the solution is within people introspecting, right? At the end of the day, I'm not telling people to believe any ideology or not, right? I don't.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, people are up to
That's
believe
exactly.
in what they want to believe in. I don't give a shit, right? What it truly is about being grounded within your beliefs, being able to have an actual material argument for what you believe in, right? Like if a person says to you, well, the economy is doing great, you ask them, what is the economy? Define the economy in the sense of the metric that you're saying it's doing good by, right? Actually get people to think on their opinions rather than spew out symbols that have self-referentiality within society that mean nothing.
That is fire. That is fire. No, I completely agree there. Now you mentioned something something about overstimulation, that how people are not able to really create this master thesis because we do have a ton of stuff that's hitting us all the time, and sometimes it's easier for people to just say, okay, you know what, I give up. I'm just going to follow this regime and try and accumulate a large amount of stocks and bonds, and in maybe 30 or 40 years, I'll have a little bit better of an understanding. I may be super polarized, but I just don't have to speak to those people who are against my views. What do you have to say about that overstimulation factor that is huge in our world right now?
Yeah, I think overstimulation breeds passivity. People and our population, because of the vast amount of information and the fact that the people that are receiving the information aren't necessarily relying on fundamentals that they are deriving from. They are relying on frameworks that have been given to them through the means of culture and society. And when people aren't grounded within their thought, right, we see this exact phenomenon occur, right? We see people being, lost within their ideologies and going towards rewards and virtues purely maintained by the system, right? I mean, I feel that, and this is especially true, the accumulation of wealth does not change one's fulfillment, right? I think we can agree with that. That's the whole
absolutely.
term of money doesn't mean happiness. And I think that that's the whole facade behind everything. It's that there really isn't anything in this society that gives you a reward greater than that accumulation of wealth. And I think it's showing within people's psyches. It's why we're seeing suicide spike. It's why we're seeing drug addiction rates spike. It's because the spirit of America is dying along with the rotting, dead, decaying body of God. Meaning the idea of modern Christian values spreading throughout populations, but that spreading dying due to vast amounts of atheism within the population. Just the fact that within the postmodern era, information is so easily accessible, so it's easier to, put off these religions.
Kind of diss different ideas.
Sure.
Yeah, I think what you said about being grounded was so important. I want to make sure that no one missed that, because what I've seen in my experience, and I don't know if you guys have had similar experiences, but when I speak to you, or when I speak to you about something that you believe in and you are grounded in, there's no anger when I speak to you about it. It's simply the want to share the vast amount of freedom that perception gives you, and the amount of joy that perception gives you. And I think when you look in society, when you look at people who are less grounded, like you say, the economy is doing great. Well, what's the economy? And people will be like, and they'll get angry with you. Yeah. And as we said in episode 1, if someone corrects you and the first thing you do is get angry, you may have an ego issue. Yeah. And I think that's so important to think about is the more that you build your own thesis, the more that you build your own beliefs based on every different perception that you can grab hold of, the more grounded and able you are to have a legitimate discussion creating the bridge, which is what we talk about on this podcast. So I think that is so important to understand what being grounded really means for how you discuss things, how much it creates a word that you're going to love, and we're about to speak about next, how much it can create novelty. Now, Devin, why don't you tell us about novelty?
Novelty and novelty theory is something that I am kind of taking the torch on. I think I would mostly, and just to tell everyone in this podcast, if you do not know who Terence McKenna is, you should right now, right, not click off this podcast. Wait till we're done talking.
Finish watching. Okay,
don't
none
be
of that.
rude.
Yeah, none of that.
But after this is done, I want you to listen to, and I don't even have to tell you a specific speech. You just listen to Terence McKenna talk, and that's all I'm going to say. Getting to novelty theory. Novelty theory is basically, to explain it from its fundamentals, is the idea of a new constant within reality.
Okay.
So we have a plethora of things that we see in our material reality that have constants within math, right? There is gravity, there's different speeds of light, there's terminal velocity, like that is gravity, but you know what I'm saying, right? There's all these different principles and different fundamentals of chemistry and physics that we know, that we apply into our world based on certain perceptual conditions and certain mathematic conditions,
Mm-hmm.
and then we get that computation of what that reality would imply.
Yeah.
Now, what novelty is essentially looking at the progression of matter. So when we look at from the very start, the Big Bang,
Mm-hmm.
okay, you have a massive amount of matter condensed together, right? Specifically unbound matter. We're
Okay.
talking about the very building blocks of atoms, right? Perhaps even quarks in the most early stages. We're talking about electrons, neutrons, and protons. And as these were extremely condensed together, and we evidently had that Big Bang, as the universe started cooling down, these particles started assimilating together into more complex atomic structures,
Mm-hmm.
creating elements, right? Some of the more rudimentary noble gases. And as you have this increasing complexity within chemistry, right, you eventually go from chemistry, right, to biochemistry. So after all of this cooling down in the universe, and after gravity has taken its toll on certain things, we start to have mass and rock getting together, right? You start to get these
Biological
protein
life.
structures occurring, right? And then these protein structures eventually assimilating together in some way, creating biological life. I mean, I don't have the answer for that. If I did, I think I'd probably be a lot more famous. But
That's true.
I think that what you see, this is basic rule of matter becoming more novel, right? And specifically if you look at the world as being coded within atoms, and even more specifically electrons, neutrons, and protons, or even more specifically quarks, you can see this assimilation between how we create video games with a vast amount of zeros and ones, right? And how reality is just coded with a vast amount of electrons, neutrons, and protons, right? And you get that fractaling off of complexity the more you throw on. The same how you can get very complex sheets of code that can model beautiful video games and structures and different realities. It's the same concept applied to matter.
So, and I'm making sure I'm following here. So until we realized how other structures kind of, protons, neutrons, electrons, how those assimilated together to create something, until we understood that, we weren't able to do the same in a video game.
Well, but that's the funny part, though. We don't know how Schrodinger's equation is still a massive problem within mathematics. It hasn't been solved. And that is one big hurdle to why we don't understand why anything's happening.
Okay.
We do not know why the underlying quantum physics lays themselves out with the properties that it has, with superposition, entanglement, and entropy, and all these, or not entropy, but all these different properties that these different particles possess are so profound within the way that they act. Another thing, if the viewers don't have the context into this, I don't really want to explain it, but because there's videos that would do it a greater justice than me. Look up the double slit experiment. It shows specifically how particles act when beings measure these phenomena within quantum physics. But I digress. Back to novelty. Essentially, within that fractaling off of structures, right? So from those rudimentary particles, those electrons, neutrons, and protons, you fractal off into more complex noble gases and more complex chemistry. From that, you get biochemistry. From biochemistry, you get life, right? And life is the vessel of consciousness, right? This consciousness we possess, I feel, is being projected from our brains being quantum computers taking in the coding of life, dissecting it within a perceptual framework of our stimuli and our reality, and putting it into more novel understandings, right? I think that humans are kind of the next stage within the development of matter becoming more novel, the same way a unbound electron, neutron, and proton could have never thought about ever becoming elements.
Okay, and so the evolution of our perceptions as a society is novelty increasing in a sense.
Yes, and that in and of itself is very egocentric, because
Okay.
you can look at how egocentric in the sense of the human, a human perspective.
We're thinking of it as a human thing.
Exactly.
Of course.
When it more so is just the assimilation of energy across, or information across space-time.
It's a universal thing.
Yes.
Whereas we as humans always think about it as like
novelty. The phenomenon of novelty can be described the same way as, yes, the information across space-time. The information being the basic zeros and ones, the electrons, neutrons, and protons, becoming more defined within their characteristics. And assimilating more.
Devin, I am like amazed at like just your brain, dude. Like, how old are you? 18, 19?
I'm 19.
19 years old, and his just idea of everything is so like baffling because you're 19, and I know grown people that like wouldn't care to take the time to like obtain the knowledge that you have, and it's like I feel like you need a bigger platform to talk about this, right? It's like you're so young, like me and Eric, like we're all the same age, and I feel like we're not given the same chances because we're so young, and you'll probably, knowing your brain already, like it's like you will get that platform eventually, but like you should get it now, and I don't think like people will give that to you because you're so young right now. And that's just crazy to me because being so young and you're this developed on your life theories and shit like that, like that's crazy to me. So good on you, dude.
It's just a lot of introspection. It's about not assimilating to your beliefs and thinking about something greater, right? I mean, the way I look at myself within this universe is I purely see myself as a engine of novelty.
You were talking about being an engine of novelty.
Yes.
Okay, now is there anything, and I'll make you say it, is there anything that you specifically think might contribute to people's thoughts in that area?
So, and to start it from a fundamental basis, essentially I think people's normal programming, people's normal perceptions on the stimuli of their reality, are usually very put together in their own minds, and common sense can seem universal across people, and that meaning that everyone thinks that their own sense is common. And I think that specifically something that we need to steer away from in specific is that circular thought. And I think that because of the normal physiology that goes on with our brains, we are experiencing reality through a basis of certain neurotransmitters, one of those neurotransmitters being serotonin, and things that kind of alter the physiological properties of the serotonin can be implementations of new compounds alike serotonin. Some of those compounds being dimethyltryptamine, psilocybin, certain psychoactive substances that all in part have a relationship. They're all connected through having a tritium isotope. DMT having 2 tritium isotopes, psilocybin having 1. The tritium isotope, if you were to look up the molecular structure, being the H3 atom, basically. It is the most energy dense thing we know of in the universe. And I think that the same way your serotonin has a makeup of certain atomic bonds to create a release of energy, the psilocybin compounds can replace your serotonin and allow your brain to have a greater computation power that serotonin otherwise wouldn't have let you have. And this gets into perception. If your perception is based off your normal perceptual stimuli gathered through these basic neurotransmitters, and all of a sudden you take something like dimethyltryptamine or psilocybin, your brain could be completely thrusted into loads more of computation power. If you think of your brain as a quantum computer, computing reality as basic code, these substances could basically be like overclocking your GPU. It is allowing your brain to analyze this material reality code that we have in a more efficient and profound way. And I think the reason why psilocybin and these mind-altering substances do change people's lives in such profound ways is because it gives insight on literal greater perception. If you look at this phenomenon as a hallucination and write it off just then and there, you're not giving it justice to what's happening physiologically in your brain and what it's making you see in the first place. Or not necessarily see as in visual, but more so, gaining a greater amount of perceptual information so that you can feed into your computer to have a better computation of what's happening.
Wow. And you were telling me earlier about a theory that you actually had in your evolutionary theory of the world.
Yeah.
That has to actually do with psychedelics. So could you go over that real quick?
Yeah. One thing that I think is very profound is how we have the capacity to take in these substances unlike other animals cannot. I think one especially profound thing within our early anthropological records was when we were Homo erectus, an ancient species of human that was pushed out of the tree line and was forced to start assimilating on the African plains. And with that, with larger predators and less of ability to flee to the tree canopy, we had to assimilate in greater packs and greater numbers, which first increased our capacity to assimilate socially, but it also increased our need for material resource to sustain those very populations. One means was hunting, right? As humans started assimilating greater packs and developed certain tools, hunting became more viable of a method. And it just so happened while we were hunting these larger game that now would be considered the modern gazelles or wildebeest. Then, within those ancient pieces of fecal matter that those animals had, you potentially could have had a psilocybin, an old genus or a species of Psilocybin cubensis growing out of one of these patties, you would say. And I think that the assumption
in the patties
within these ancient pieces of animal fecal matter, there could have potentially been a genus or species of Psilocybin cubensis, which contains psilocybin, and especially then psilocybin, since it's unformed and hasn't been assimilated to the human brain yet, as the potential kind of adoption of these things into our omnivorous diet occurred, the process of neurogenesis would have started happening profoundly within our population, and it could have started developing the kind of ability and the capacity for our human brains to take in these specific substances, harboring this tritium isotope that contains so much energy. And the fact that it's getting thrown into our neuroreceptors and giving us perceptual information on the world that we otherwise wouldn't have.
Wow. So your theory is kind of that the human consciousness or perception, or what we would call consciousness, was created by these.
Yes, I feel that our capacity for drugs is directly correlated with the potential adoption of these substances into our diet at a very early stage in our evolution. Yeah.
Wow.
There's no other natural phenomenon on the planet that you could kind of attribute this kind of ascension with language and understanding that humans have on the world and on the nature of reality.
Wow, and you connected it to something. Did you connect it to something biblical at some point? You were telling me.
Yeah, I think this also does assimilate heavily with Adam and Eve in the Genesis story, where humans are just another animal in the Garden of Eve, and they're just chilling out, being animals, having animal instincts until they eat this forbidden fruit. That human intuition was to blame, right? Mm. Human intuition being the snake. Right? And why does the snake crawl on his belly when it's the snake? Well, that's because human intuition is human intuition. It is inherent that humans are going to be explorative on their environments and have that intuition to be extra explorative on their environment. So, because of that, it was a result that we included these things in our diet, which led to an explosive expansion within our computation power in our brain. That's why you see the insane, like when you look at a woman giving birth, you could see how specifically the head of an infant can be very problematic for the woman's vaginal cavity, right? And you can see how a plethora of other animals like horses and cows and lots of other mammals that give live births have plenty big holes to birth their offspring out of. It just seems that humans in specific had this massive explosion within the evolution of our brains due to the introduction of psilocybin and neurogenesis happening and expanding our perceptions and consciousness, that it allowed for this rocket fuel of evolution neurologically.
So actually brains getting bigger and heads
Yes.
getting, wow.
And that's why you see the complication within pregnancy, and that's why it's only kind of been curbed over the past few decades, not few decades, but over the past 100 years, because of modern science and medicine and things. But
Wow.
yeah, I do feel that that's another thing that could kind of explain it on like a fundamental basis.
Wow, that's crazy, the connection between biblical, evolutionary, biological, all kinds of different connections there. That's really interesting.
Sure, yeah.
So, Devin, you are a pacifist, correct?
Yeah, no, I am.
Can you tell us like how you became that, or like what made you decide that you're a pacifist?
Yeah, I think pacifism, to put it in the most simple terms, it's a virtue. So the same way someone would see being courageous, I think if someone is giving you mental hardship, and this is in the micro sense, peer to peer, I think when someone is giving you hardship or someone isn't assimilating with your beliefs or is causing physical altercation, I feel that the most courageous thing to do is to not give up the situation, but understand the reasons for it. Like, obviously, if I'm pinned in a corner and a dude's trying to kill me, I'm not going to be a pacifist. But it's within the context of how you respect your fellow man. Being a pacifist is about trying to understand the underlying intellectual framework that people are coming from, rather than assert violence so that you can get through your points. This is the same phenomenon within how lots of people parent that I don't agree with. I feel that kids should fundamentally respect the parent for the parent having good ideology and understanding, not for the fact that the parent's going to beat their ass. And this is something that bred aggression within generations in the past. And it's something that Gen Z is getting away from, especially now, because of how ideological the internet's making us. And also how that parenting structure is kind of dying off, where beating your kids isn't so much of a norm nowadays.
Yeah, it's not a great parenting strategy in the looks of everyone else nowadays as it was before.
Yeah,
and that's also an argument of pacifism, of thinking, right? And that's how I wanted to tie it and describe it. It's that that is directly going against pacifism, beating your kids, because instead of taking a route of trying to assimilate intellectually with the child and have them identify actual truths based on a refined perception, they're instead getting a philosophy or ideology literally beaten into them. The same way that the people within our political sphere and political compass, and really, to put it in the best terms possible, our perceptual understanding of the political sphere is all built off this abusive relationship between the people and government. And you can see the same dynamic of a child getting beaten to assimilate to his parents' wants as a person going to jail because he was possessing a substance the government didn't agree you could have, right? It is exactly the same phenomenon, and it's why that behavior fractals into all of our institutions. It's because everyone within modern society is a cuck to the system, is a cog within the machine that really isn't benefiting them, and the means of keeping them within the machine is cultural ostracism, jail time, right? A plethora of things.
And so, I mean, kind of wrapping up here, what I've kind of learned from you from this entire podcasts we've done is, in a sense, your main idea is to push people to see the perceptions of others and how they got to the ideology that they are using, instead of just kind of fighting the ideology with your own, because it'll never work. And that's the most courageous thing that a human can do. Introspect.
Is give up your own ideologies that you fundamentally rely on, right? And this goes back to a big claim that I like to make that pisses people off, because we all like believing that we're special, is that self is inherently an illusion, right? Self is basically your perceptions, your perceptual information of all of the electrons, neutrons, and protons, those zeros, ones, twos, right? Taking in that perceptual understanding and outputting your opinions, right? I think that if all we really are is a conglomerate of the perceptual stimuli that we've experienced throughout our entire life, well, then that is inherently... then we are inherently not ourselves. We are products of our reality. And I think that the one way to go outside the bounds of your reality, the same way an atom is restricted to its innate physics and the subset of physics it's within, humans program themselves to specific perceptions within reality. And it's about breaking from those core fundamental perceptions so you can evidently be potentially that atom that turns into an element.
Wow. Almost like a ascension level thing is what you're talking about here.
Yes, this is also gets into the idea of enlightenment through conquering your own human nature. It's that when you're assimilated to things aligned with your inherent human nature, it's the same way as an atom going along with its basic subset of physics. You need to be something more so that the parts can become, or so that the whole can become greater than the parts.
Wow. That is a very interesting idea there. Yeah. That the whole is, we are a part, and we should think for the whole instead of having that individualistic idea. Yeah, that's crazy. I think a tangible thing that people can take away from this, we've spoken existentially, and I think it's very important to do that, and allow those who come onto the podcast to talk about whatever in the world they want. But I think something tangible that you can take away is think for yourself and listen. Think for yourself and listen. And when the next time someone attacks you with a belief or attacks you on one of your beliefs, just start asking them questions on how they got to theirs. And it's going to drop down because they want to talk about their beliefs. And if you're able to introspect and relax and say, how do I analyze how they got to their beliefs, it's going to be a much more stimulating, passive conversation.
Absolutely.
So, and I think that one thing I really do want to stress is if you ever hear someone say, that's just how it is, I want you to immediately slap I'm just kidding. but realistically though, when people say that's just how it is, they are perpetuating the behavior. They are saying that's just how it is. What it starts with is individuals taking in others' perceptions, not for the fact that he's Republican, not for the fact that he's Democrat, not for the fact that he's white, not for the fact that he's black, but for the fact that he's a human, and that ultimately we're on this planet and there really is nothing that isn't temporary. Everything can be taken away from us. Cultures can destabilize, right? It's just that we're very short-term creatures, that we don't think about these things. We think about things very retrospectively to the context of our environment and our current perceptions. But beyond that, it's about ascending above your current perceptions and taking in your fellow man's perceptions, just the fact that he's a human. Or not even he, but just the fact that they're a human. It's so important that we develop a common efficacy towards loving your fellow human instead of loving your fellow political ideology. And when we start from a common basis, we can work into a more intricate spectrum of beliefs will hold across our society. And I think it truly does start with people assimilating, not with yelling out their other ideological propositions.
Wow. That was quite the way to wrap up episode 3 of The Youthful Bridge. Thank you guys so much for watching.